Hey everybody, how's it going? Corey here from Themeco with a quick overview of our brand new grid element. Now the CSS Grid spec is something we've been really excited to tackle for quite some time. It's just been a bit of a waiting game for the spec itself to get ironed out and for browsers to implement it consistently across the board. At first glance, the element might not appear too dissimilar from our recently updated row element. However, there's a lot going on with the CSS Grid spec, and we've tried to balance the complexity of that while still making it approachable in the tools and still being able to leverage some of those most powerful features of the spec itself. So let's just dive right in. One of the most primary differences between a Flexbox layout or our old row element and the new grid spec and this grid element is the way that the overall layout is constructed. To see how that works, let's go up here to our grid layout control. Now in this control, you'll see that we've got two inputs. We have columns template and rows template. And this is where you will define the overall structure of your grid. For example, with this layout, I'm recreating a traditional 4-column setup. Now, you'll notice that the syntax is a little bit different to probably what you've seen before on our row element. We've got this one FR unit. Now, this is a new bit of syntax for the grid spec itself, and you can basically think of it as a fractional unit. And this is currently saying I would like to have 4 equally wide columns set up on my grid. So instead of having to write in 25% 4 times over, we can simply write in 1FR and the browser will do the math for us. You'll also notice that right above here, we have a little bit of a preview where we're trying to give you a rough estimate of what the template you're creating should look like over in the preview area, which is especially helpful when we start introducing rows and how we can define those. Now, you'll see in my example currently that I've got 8 cells over here. We call these cells inside the grid. And for example, if I wanted this second column here, where 2 and 6 are falling, to be just a little bit wider, I could experiment with this FR value. I could say 2FR, and you'll see what's happened here is that my 3 1FR values are corresponding over here to my 1, 5, 3, 7, and 4, 8 column. And those have scrunched down a little bit, while this grouping has grown, because we want this 2FR grouping to be double the spacing of these 1FR values. Another thing that we can do very easily with the grid spec is mix different values. So for example, I can make these all 1FR again, and I might want these outer columns to be 200 pixels and have a fixed value. Let's make that a little smaller so we can see it. Let's do 100. So we can see that we've got a fixed 100 pixel value there. And as I size down, those columns to the outside are remaining at 100 pixels, but my 2 inner columns are an equal width that is spanning the remaining space of that grid. So that's a pretty cool trick to take advantage of as well. Now again, remember that we're just defining the overall columns template here on the grid. So I've got 8 cells, but if I wanted it to fall back to 3 columns here, I could simply remove this 1FR value, and now we've got 3 equal columns going across the grid. So it's very easy to experiment with the number of columns you'd like to lay your content out in and the sizing of those columns, since we can mix values and we can use this 1FR unit for some very quick and easy math that the browser leverages for us. Now, so far I've just been using auto rows, which effectively means for a situation like this, where I've got 4 equal columns, whenever I get to this 5th cell that is beyond the count of the columns in my grid, it's just going to wrap to a new line. And we can see that right here. 5 through 8 to fall into this new line, but they are still following the template of my columns here. Where things get really fun with CSS Grid is that we can create these sort of 2-dimensional relationships between height and width amongst our grid. So what that basically means is I could type in 1FR here for my rows, and you can see that our preview here has now reflected that we are explicitly stating we want 2 rows in this grid. Now, what I could do is take this one step further, and if I wanted this second row to be 1.5 times as tall as my first line, I could say 1.5 FR. And you'll see that our second line here is 1.5 times as tall as our first line here. And also, my preview over here in the grid layout has reflected that. Now again, there are a lot of implications with what you can do with these types of layouts, and I do plan on exploring them in much more detail later. So just hang with me for a bit because we're just going to keep running through the element for the time being, but do keep in mind that there will be some videos in the coming weeks where we really dive deep on how to leverage these row templates and how to get some really cool responsive layouts. All right, so for the time being, I'm just going to set this back to auto, have my auto rows again. A couple final things about this control are that you can set this template responsively here. So all I have to do is click to my different breakpoints, and I can see exactly what my grid should be doing at that particular breakpoint. So for example, if I size my window down here, you can see that we've gone down to our medium breakpoint. We've got 1FR, 1FR, which is basically a 50-50 layout. That is reflected in my preview up here, and it's also reflected in the actual preview over here to the right. So again, if I wanted to, let's say on this one particular breakpoint, I wanted it to be 3 columns, we can add 1FR. I've got my 3 columns here on medium. Down on small, I've got 2, and then so on and so forth. The final thing to take note of in this particular control is this little cog icon here. There will be times for certain layouts where you might experiment with some very detailed or intricate layouts that might have quite a few values or some complex values here. So clicking on this cog will reveal a little value list here, which basically reflects the values we've got over here. And if these were different, we could take one, drag and drop it into a different position, duplicate a value, delete a value, and we can even experiment with hiding a value temporarily just to see how it might change the overall look. For example, I could visually hide this 1FR value to see it as 3 columns and then pop it back to 4, just to quickly experiment with what things look like turning something on and off. So that is basically the grid layout control in a nutshell. This is where you will manage your overall structure, the responsive nature of that structuring, and then also experiment with more complex layouts if you need to, using this Manage Template button here. Beyond that, down in our setup box here, we've got a few controls that you'll probably be familiar with if you've played around with the new Flexbox powered row. We can use the X and Y content to align our overall content within the grid itself. Now, again, I'll explore this more in some additional videos later on, but think of this as positioning all of your cells within the grid as a whole. So very quickly, let's say I had 100 pixels in 4 equal width columns. I could jump down here to my X and Y content, and I could horizontally place that to the start of the container, the end. I could space them out with space in between. I could have them spaced evenly. So this X and Y content is how all of the cells are placed within the grid element as a whole. We can see that box there outlined with the blue observer. And then we have our X and Y items alignment, which you can effectively think of as the way that the content inside each of these cells is aligned. Now, for some of these cells, I've added a little bit more space around these numbers to see how this works. But for example, right now, they're both being stretched out horizontally and vertically. That's how I'm getting these equal width columns and equal height columns. However, I could take this X value and I could place it to the start, and you'll see that since all of these numbers have the same width here, they're all aligning over to that edge, but still have the same width. Or I could center them, place them to the end, or stretch them back out within that grid cell itself. And then I can also do the same across the Y-axis. So I could align them to the start, and again, we'll see that our 1 here has some spacing, different than 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Place those to the center, the end, or stretch them back out. So lots of possibilities just right here with our general cell placement. And then we've got our X and Y gap, which is similar to our updated row element. So we can take this and zero it out if we want to have sort of a marginless look, or we could have a very specific small value. Lots of really cool stuff to play around with here in terms of mixing and matching and just experimenting with what the general look is you're going for. So that is basically the grid parent in a nutshell. Now, the cells inside the grid is where things start to get really fun, because this is where the real power of CSS Grid starts to come into play. One of the biggest features about CSS Grid is that we can take any cell within the template that we've defined and we can place it along those grid tracks that we've set up here. Remember our preview that we had over in the grid layout? We can kind of imagine those as tracks where we can position any of these cells. Now, if I inspect cell number 2 here, you'll see again we've got this responsive layout control, and I'm currently using auto placement. This basically just means when I add a new cell to this grid, it's going to simply keep filing in line and just add one to the end. However, if I wanted a specific cell to do something very particular on a certain layout, I can click into this box and we'll see this alignment and axis positioning control here. Basically what we can do with this is tell that cell exactly where to go using a coordinate system on the grid. For example, I might want this second cell here to span the width of 2 and 3. So I could start it at 2. This is starting at my second line. And I want it to go to the 4th line over here, because this is, when you create these grid tracks, you've got to think of them as lines. We've got our first line over here, 2, 3, and then 4. So I would want it to end at 4, and you'll see that our second cell has grown to fill all of that space, and all of our other autoplay cells are simply just filing in line to go where they need to go. Additionally, if I wanted, I could use the placement controls here to place that content within that space in a very unique way. Again, I'm just trying to give some quick ideas here of how you can use this. We're going to go into much more detail on this later. And there's also some different syntax you can take advantage of here. For example, if we don't want to have to remember our grid lines, we could say span 2, which gives us the same result. And if we wanted this to go all the way to the end of the column, we can use negative numbers to say, push this cell all the way to the very end of the grid. Or we could say -2, which is offset by 1, and so on and so forth. Now, while all of this is very cool, we knew that manually writing in these values could be very cumbersome over time, especially when you're just trying to experiment with the layout, try different ideas out. So it's because of that that we introduced this cell layout editor. So any grid that you add to your page, when you hover over it, you'll see this tiny little purple button that appears in the upper right corner. Clicking on that button will reveal an overlay of your grid that you've defined, and you can see exactly what's going on with the track positioning as well as how your cells are being placed on that grid. Now it's a little hard to see because this cell is actually orange, the background of it, but any cell that has some type of placement to it, for example, it's being specifically set on an axis, that cell is no longer using auto placement like our other cells. And you'll notice that all of these have kind of a faint purple overlay. So anything that is placed on the grid will get this orange overlay and be outlined in orange. Now, instead of having to manually write in all of these coordinates anytime you want to make a change, we can instead hover over a cell and we can grab one of these handles and we can simply resize it on the grid. And you'll notice when I place this cell here that all of my coordinates here got updated. Now if I want this number 2 cell to span those 2 columns again, I can simply drag it over and you'll see that our x-axis has been updated here. Now we can also take this cell and we could drag it down and place it here. And again, remember that all of my auto-place cells are trying to move in and fill up as much space as they can. So since they're using auto placement, they will move up in line, and this place cell can go anywhere you want it to be. I could simply take this back up here, and maybe let's take number 6, drag it down, number 8, drag it over. Let's move 3 down here, and then we'll turn this off. And you can see that very quickly we've experimented with a very unique and pretty wild layout. And we can simply jump back up here to our grid. We can try different gap values. We can try different alignment stuff here. There's just a lot to experiment with the grid element as a whole. But the main thing to keep in mind here is that the cell layout editor is a huge help in terms of visualizing your grid and being able to quickly and easily experiment with different layouts. Now, if you've played around with a few things and decided that you aren't totally in love with the layout you're using and you just want to go back to auto positioning, you can right click on any cell, and within the context menu here, we can click use auto placement. So this will zero out all of these values, and without you having to edit everything manually, you can just put it right back to where it should be in the grid. And a quick note on the layout editor as a whole. You'll notice that any unoccupied track in your grid will be represented by this kind of faint purple cell with a dashed outline. So those are kind of free spaces you can work in. If it's purple with a solid outline like these, that means it's occupied by a cell. And then if it has an orange outline or an orange overlay, that means that that cell is currently placed on the grid. So let me just turn this off. We will zero out all of our cells here. Now we're back to our auto-placed grid. And again, take note that this cell layout control works for every breakpoint. So you can update the layout of the grid itself for every breakpoint, and then you can position every cell on your grid to any coordinate on that grid at any breakpoint. So you truly have all of the layout flexibility you could ever need to move items around, play with spacing, get things looking pixel perfect on any breakpoint. Another great thing to keep in mind too is that if you have sized your browser down, and you'll notice that this has changed to our medium breakpoint, if you open the cell layout editor here, any changes you make while it's sized at this medium breakpoint will be applied just to that breakpoint. So it's very easy to resize your browser to here, make some changes, then bring it back up to our large breakpoint, for example, make some changes here, and within a couple minutes, you can very easily accomplish some super complex layouts. Now there's just a couple other little things to note. Basically, the cell looks a lot like the columns in the row, and we do have optional Flexbox Layout for the content inside that cell. So for example, if I click on one here, I've got Flexbox turned on, and I can use that to horizontally align the content inside that cell, vertically align the content inside that cell. And this is actually spaced out here, so you didn't see it change, but the idea is that we can position our content inside our cells just like we can in the columns. Additionally, there are some new right-click context menu actions that we can use as well. You can right-click anywhere on a layout when you're working on the cell or the grid, and we can copy a cell's position, and then we can either paste that to a new breakpoint or apply it to all. So for example, if you had a layout where maybe for whatever reason this last cell here, you always wanted to be positioned up here in this number 1 spot, we could jump up here, we could simply drag our cell up here, and you'll see that we've got our 1, 2, 1, 2. We could then take this, we could either copy it and apply it to another breakpoint, or we could simply apply it to all, and you'll see that all of our breakpoints are now using that positioning. And we can also do the exact same thing on our grid. So for example, if we had this 4-column layout and we knew we wanted to use that on our medium breakpoint without having to update this here, we could simply copy this layout, and then we can right-click either on the tab or click into the tab itself, right-click here, and then we can paste that layout or apply it to all if we wanted to. So that's just a couple really quick time savers there. And then finally, with our cell order, if you right-click on any cell over here, we've got these options to bring the cell forward, push it back, or do anything in between. So basically, this comes into play when you start layering elements, because one of the cool things about the grid spec is, for example, I might move this 2 over here and this 1 over here, and I turn this off, you'll see that both of these cells are occupying this same second column track here. So if I want to move those around on the sort of Z index coming towards me out of my screen, I'm going to need to do one of two things. Either specifically set a Z index here that is higher to push that up, or if I'm using auto positioning with my cells, just the general order of the cells in here will determine which one is on top. So for example, I could right click here and click bring forward, and that has pushed my number 1 down here, which is putting it in front of my second column over here. So that's basically it for this video. Just a super quick rundown of the new features that you'll find in the grid element and kind of getting an idea of how to use them. Again, we're going to be bringing a lot more video content to you all in the coming weeks about the grid element, about how to accomplish certain layouts, and lots more fun stuff. So we are really excited about that, and definitely keep a lookout for that in the coming weeks.